Karen Williams peered out from her front window, her fingers resting on the blinds, cautiously pulling them back just enough to catch a glimpse of her new neighbors. Her face twisted in a subtle frown as she watched them unload yet another box from the moving truck. The crisp, perfectly manicured lawns of Maple Ridge Lane gleamed in the early afternoon sun, but Karen's attention was solely fixed on the Johnsons. "Great," she muttered to herself, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Just what this neighborhood needs. More outsiders." Anthony and Jessica Johnson moved with an air of confidence, laughing softly with each other as they lifted boxes labeled kitchen and books into the house. Their two children, a boy and a girl, were running around in the front yard, their carefree laughter filling the suburban air. To most people, this scene would have seemed idyllic, a family starting fresh in a new home. But to Karen, it was yet another sign of how things were changing, and not for the better. Karen prided herself on being a community leader, though no one had actually given her that title. For years, she had taken it upon herself to keep a close watch on her neighborhood, believing it was her duty to maintain the quality of Maple Ridge. She had moved into this quiet, suburban haven over 2 decades ago, back when the street was predominantly occupied by families who looked, acted, and thought just like her. In Karen's mind, things had been perfect back then. Safe. Predictable. She knew everyone by name, waved to them as she walked her dog every morning, and held bake sales and fundraisers for the local community center. Life was orderly, just the way she liked it. But over the past few years, things had started to shift. New families were moving in, people from different backgrounds and cultures. Karen told herself that she wasn't racist or prejudiced, but she couldn't deny that these changes made her uncomfortable. The Johnson family was the latest addition to this transformation, and Karen didn't like the look of them. She had no idea who they were, but that didn't matter. They didn't belong. Not here. She let the blinds snap back into place and turned to her husband, Dave, who sat at the kitchen table with his nose buried in the newspaper. "Did you see them?" The new family, Karen asked, her voice dripping with disdain. Dave barely glanced up, used to his wife's nosiness. "Yeah, I saw them. What about it?" "What about it?" Karen repeated, incredulous. "They're different, Dave. Have you ever seen people like that moving into this neighborhood? I mean, really, they don't fit in here." Dave sighed, turning a page in the newspaper. "Karen, it's 2024. People move in and out all the time. Just because they're different doesn't mean they don't belong." Karen folded her arms across her chest, her expression hardening. "It's not about them being different. It's about keeping our community safe and respectable. You know how things are these days. People come in and start changing things. It won't be long before we have noise, crime, and who knows what else. Mark my words." Dave chuckled softly. "You always jump to the worst-case scenario. They're probably just a normal family moving in, trying to start a new life. You don't even know them." "Exactly," Karen snapped, her voice rising. "I don't know them. That's the problem. We don't know what they're about, what kind of people they are." She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "And that's why I'm going to find out." Later that evening, Karen decided to do what she did best: observe. After all, in her mind, it wasn't snooping if you were doing it for the greater good. She slipped out of her house under the guise of walking her dog, Bella, and casually strolled by the Johnsons' house, hoping to overhear a conversation or catch a glimpse of something that might confirm her suspicions. She saw Anthony and Jessica sitting on their front porch, sipping what looked like wine, chatting quietly as their children played inside. "Look at them," Karen muttered to Bella, tugging the leash slightly. "Sitting there like they own the place. Who drinks wine on a weekday? Probably trying to show off." As Karen walked past their house, she glanced over at them, her eyes narrowing. Anthony noticed her and gave a friendly wave, but Karen pretended not to see him. She wasn't ready to engage. Not yet. She needed more information, more proof that this family didn't fit in. The next morning, Karen sat at her computer, scrolling through the neighborhood association's website. There had to be some rules, some guidelines these people were breaking. After all, she had heard that their moving truck had been parked on the street past 10 p.m., and the association had strict policies about that sort of thing. But as she skimmed through the regulations, nothing jumped out at her. Everything seemed to be in order. Frustrated, Karen clicked through various social media pages, hoping to find anything that would give her ammunition. Her eyes lit up when she found Jessica's profile. She scrolled through photos of their family vacations, their achievements, and their seemingly perfect life. Jessica had shared pictures of her and Anthony at work, both in professional attire, with captions about their successful careers. Karen clicked on Jessica's bio and read the words that made her heart sink. State attorney's office. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Karen groaned. "They're lawyers. Just perfect." Her mind raced. Lawyers. That meant they knew how to navigate the system. That meant they knew how to get away with things. Karen's paranoia deepened. In her mind, this wasn't just a harmless family moving into her neighborhood. This was a family with power that could undermine everything she had worked to protect. As the days passed, Karen's obsession with the Johnsons grew. She began documenting every little thing they did, what time they left the house, how often they had guests, how late their lights stayed on at night. She shared her concerns with her closest friend and neighbor, Linda, over coffee one morning. "Linda, I'm telling you, there's something off about them," Karen said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "They're always having people over, always coming and going. It's suspicious." Linda, who was more of a passive listener than an active participant in Karen's schemes, sipped her coffee and raised an eyebrow. "Karen, they're probably just settling in, making friends, getting to know people. We were like that when we first moved in, remember?" Karen shook her head. "No, this is different. I just have a feeling. I don't trust them." A feeling? Linda laughed softly. "Karen, you don't even know them. You're jumping to conclusions." "Maybe," Karen replied, her voice tense. "But I've been right before. You remember that time with the Petersons? I knew something was off with them, and it turned out they were running an unlicensed daycare out of their basement. If I hadn't reported them, who knows what could have happened." Linda sighed. "Yeah, I remember. But this isn't the same. These people are lawyers, for God's sake. They're probably more law-abiding than the rest of us." Karen wasn't convinced. She had always trusted her instincts, and her instincts told her there was something wrong with the Johnsons. But no matter how much she watched, no matter how much she dug, she couldn't find anything concrete. And that frustrated her more than anything. One Saturday morning, about a week after the Johnsons had moved in, Karen's patience finally ran out. She was sitting on her porch, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone, when she heard laughter coming from next door. She glanced over and saw that the Johnsons were hosting a small gathering in their backyard. A few friends had joined them, and their children were playing in the yard, their voices carrying through the fence. To Karen, the laughter felt like a personal affront. "Of course they're having a party," she muttered under her breath. No respect for the neighborhood at all. She marched inside, grabbed her phone and called Dave, who was out running errands. "Dave, did you know the Johnsons are having some kind of party? It's so loud, they're not even trying to keep it down." On the other end of the line, Dave sighed. "Karen, it's a Saturday. People are allowed to have gatherings. What do you want me to do about it?" "I want you to back me up when I call the neighborhood association," Karen snapped. "This is exactly what I was worried about." "Karen, for the love of God, just leave them alone. They're not hurting anyone." Dave's frustration was clear in his voice. "You're obsessing over this." But Karen wasn't listening. She had already hung up the phone, her mind racing with thoughts of how this gathering could be the first step toward the decline of her beloved Maple Ridge. That evening, as the sun began to set and the Johnsons' gathering continued, Karen could no longer contain herself. She stormed over to the fence that separated their yards, her hands trembling with anger. She spotted Anthony standing by the grill, chatting with a friend. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice sharp. Anthony turned, a friendly smile on his face. "Oh, hey there, Karen, right? How's it going?" Karen crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Do you know what time it is? This party has been going on for hours. Some of us like to have peace and quiet on the weekends." Anthony's smile faltered, but he remained calm. "I'm sorry if we're disturbing you. We're just having a small get-together with some friends. We'll keep it down." But Karen wasn't satisfied. It's not just about the noise. There are rules in this neighborhood. You can't just do whatever you want. Jessica, who had overheard the conversation, walked over, her expression calm but firm. "We're aware of the rules, Karen. We're not breaking any of them. We've been mindful of the noise, and it's still early. But if it's bothering you, we'll try to keep it down." Karen's face flushed with anger. I don't think you understand. This is a quiet, respectable neighborhood, and we like to keep it that way. I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've seen what happens when people don't respect the community. Jessica raised an eyebrow, her patience wearing thin. We respect the community, Karen. We're part of it now, just like you. We're not here to cause any problems. Karen scoffed. We'll see about that. She turned on her heel and marched back to her house, fuming. Inside, she grabbed her phone and hovered over the keypad. Her mind raced. If they won't listen to reason, maybe they'll listen to the police. The night was settling in, but Karen's anger hadn't. The Johnsons' gathering continued, though it had shifted from the lively barbecue earlier in the day to something more subdued, with just a few lingering guests, their voices floating softly in the summer air. It was nothing outrageous, nothing that would typically warrant a second glance from a neighbor. But Karen wasn't an ordinary neighbor. She paced in her kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. They think they can just ignore me, she muttered under her breath, the anger boiling inside her like a kettle about to spill over. I warned them. I told them the rules. She hovered over the keypad again, her mind racing between hesitation and the overwhelming urge to assert her authority. I've had enough of this, she finally said, her resolve hardening as she tapped in the number for the non-emergency police line. Her fingers moved quickly, fueled by the adrenaline coursing through her. Maple Ridge Police Department, how can I help you? Came the calm, collected voice of the dispatcher on the other end. Karen cleared her throat, trying to make her voice sound equally calm, though it shook with barely contained frustration. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at my neighbor's house, she said, eyes narrowing as she glanced out her window toward the Johnsons' yard. They're having some kind of loud party. It's been going on for hours, and they're disturbing the peace. There was a pause on the other end as the dispatcher took in her report. Okay, Ma, I am. Can you give me the address? Karen rattled off the address with precision, her eyes fixed on the glow of the Johnsons' backyard lights. This isn't the first time they've done this, she added, embellishing the situation. There's always noise, and I've seen people coming and going. I don't know what's really going on over there, but it doesn't feel right. I think you should send someone to check it out. Another pause, longer this time, and then the dispatcher's voice, measured and professional, will send someone over to take a look. Please stay inside your home, Ma, I am, and avoid confrontation. Of course, Karen replied, feeling a rush of satisfaction. She hung up the phone and exhaled deeply, her nerves tingling with a mix of triumph and anticipation. That should put them in their place, she said to herself, settling into her living room chair with a smug sense of accomplishment. Outside, the night was still peaceful. The low murmur of the Johnsons' gathering continued, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their yard. Anthony and Jessica were wrapping up the evening, chatting with the last of their guests when they heard the unmistakable sound of car tires crunching on the gravel street. The glow of red and blue lights flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows over the neighborhood. Jessica turned to Anthony, her brow furrowing. Is that the police, she asked, her voice low but tinged with concern. Anthony glanced toward the street, his expression tightening as he saw the two police cruisers pull up in front of their house. Looks like it, he muttered, annoyance flickering across his face. This is probably Karen's doing. Jessica sighed, her patience wearing thin. What is her problem? Before they could speculate further, two officers stepped out of the cruisers, their flashlights slicing through the darkness as they approached the house. Anthony straightened, motioning for Jessica to stay calm. Let's just talk to them, he said quietly. We're not doing anything wrong. The officers stopped just inside the gate, their expressions neutral but cautious as they surveyed the scene. The older of the two, Officer Martinez, stepped forward and nodded curtly. Evening, he said, his tone polite but firm. We received a noise complaint from a neighbor. Mind if we ask a few questions? Anthony forced a smile, though his frustration was barely concealed. Of course, officers, he said, keeping his voice measured. We were just finishing up a small gathering with a few friends. I'm sure it's not as loud as it was earlier, but we'll be happy to comply with any requests you have. Jessica stood beside him, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the officers' faces for any sign of prejudice. She could sense it, an unspoken tension that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. It wasn't the first time they had dealt with this kind of situation. As black professionals, they were all too familiar with how quickly things could escalate, even when they were on the right side of the law. Officer Martinez glanced toward the backyard, where a few guests were still chatting, clearly unaware of the police presence. His partner, Officer Jenkins, stepped forward, holding up a notepad. "We've had reports of loud noise and possible suspicious activity," Jenkins said, his voice more clipped than Martinez's. "Mind if we take a look around?" Anthony's eyes narrowed, but he remained calm. "Suspicious activity? We're just having a small gathering with a few friends. There's nothing suspicious going on here. You're welcome to take a look if you feel it's necessary, but I think you'll find everything's in order." Martinez gave a slight nod, sensing the tension in the air. "No need for any drama," he said, his tone softening. "We just have to check out any calls we receive. If everything's fine, we'll be on our way." Jessica's hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice calm and steady. "We've lived here for just over a week, officers. We've done nothing wrong. If you're here because of that woman next door, Karen, I think you'll find she's got a history of making problems where there aren't any." Jenkins' eyes flickered toward Karen's house. He had dealt with similar complaints in other neighborhoods, where one person seemed determined to stir up trouble over trivial issues. "Just doing our job," Jenkins replied, though his voice lacked the edge it had earlier. "And we respect that," Anthony said, stepping forward slightly. "But for the record, we both work for the state attorney's office. My wife and I are lawyers. We know the law, and we know our rights. We've complied with every neighborhood regulation since we moved in." The mention of their professions caused a subtle shift in the officer's demeanor. Martinez's eyebrows lifted slightly in recognition, and Jenkins hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. "Lawyers for the state," Martinez said, a hint of respect creeping into his voice. "Didn't know that." "Well, now you do," Jessica said, her voice firm. "So, if there's anything else we need to address, let's do it now." The officers exchanged glances, clearly beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be the routine check they had anticipated. Martinez took a step back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of de-escalation. "Look, I think we're good here," he said, his tone more relaxed now. "If the noise gets too loud again, just keep it down for the night. Otherwise, we'll call this a misunderstanding." Jenkins scribbled something on his notepad before looking up at Anthony and Jessica. "Appreciate your cooperation," he said, his voice now more neutral. "We'll let the neighbor know we didn't find anything out of the ordinary." Anthony nodded, though the tension in his jaw was still visible. "Thank you, officers. Have a good night." As the police turned to leave, the weight of the situation began to settle over the Johnsons. Jessica exhaled deeply, her body relaxing slightly as the police cruisers pulled away, but her relief was short-lived. Across the street, she could see Karen standing on her porch, watching the entire interaction unfold. Her face was a mask of barely concealed anger, her eyes narrowed as she met Jessica's gaze. "She won't stop," Jessica said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. "She's going to keep pushing until she gets what she wants." Anthony nodded, his expression hardening. "Let her. We're not going anywhere." Meanwhile, inside her house, Karen fumed. Her plan hadn't worked out the way she had hoped. She had expected the police to arrive, issue stern warnings, maybe even scare the Johnsons into thinking twice about having loud gatherings. Instead, they had spoken to the officers calmly, confidently, like they were the ones in control of the situation. "Lawyers," Karen spat under her breath, pacing back and forth in her living room. "Who do they think they are, throwing that in my face?" She felt humiliated, powerless. It wasn't supposed to go this way. The police were supposed to be on her side, reinforcing the boundaries of the neighborhood, keeping it the way it had always been. Instead, they had practically let the Johnsons off without so much as a warning. But Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. If the police weren't going to take her side, she would have to find another way. She pulled out her phone and opened the neighborhood association's website again. Maybe the police hadn't seen anything suspicious, but there were still rules. There were always rules. She began composing an email to the neighborhood association's board, carefully detailing her complaints. She mentioned the loud noise, the late-night gatherings, and the suspicious activity she had observed over the past week. She exaggerated, of course, claiming that cars had been coming and going at odd hours, and that she had seen people loitering near the Johnsons' house. If she couldn't get the police to act, maybe the neighborhood association would. As she typed, her frustration grew. "They don't belong here," she muttered, her fingers tapping furiously on the keyboard. "This is my neighborhood. I've worked too hard to let people like them ruin it." She hit send with a sense of finality, feeling a small flicker of satisfaction. But even as she sat back, her hands still trembling, she knew deep down that this wasn't the end. The Johnsons weren't going to back down, and neither was she. In her mind, the battle for Maple Ridge had just begun. As the night drew on, the Johnsons wrapped up their gathering, their guests filtering out quietly. Jessica stood on the porch, her arms crossed, watching the taillights of the last car disappear into the distance. She could feel the weight of Karen's eyes on them, even though she couldn't see her. "We can't keep doing this," she said softly, turning to Anthony. "She's going to keep finding ways to make our lives miserable." Anthony nodded, his expression grim. "I know. But we're not going to let her win. We've dealt with people like her before. We'll handle this the right way." Jessica sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "It just feels like no matter what we do, she's always going to see us as the enemy. It doesn't matter that we're successful, that we follow the rules. In her eyes, we'll never belong here." Anthony placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We belong wherever we choose to be. And if she can't handle that, it's her problem, not ours." Jessica nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. She knew that Anthony was right. They had every right to be there, and they weren't going to let Karen's prejudice push them out. But she also knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Inside Karen's house, the light from her computer screen cast an eerie glow across her face as she refreshed her inbox, waiting for a response from the neighborhood association. The battle lines had been drawn. Now, it was only a matter of time. The next morning, Karen was up early, sitting at her computer with a steaming cup of coffee. She refreshed her inbox for the 100th time since last night, waiting for a response from the neighborhood association. Her message had been thorough, detailing her concerns about the Johnsons and their activities, and she was certain the board would take her seriously. After all, she had been an upstanding member of this community for years. People respected her. Listen to her. They would act. The email she'd sent described the Johnsons as disruptive and not respectful of neighborhood norms, painting a picture of a family that brought chaos and noise to an otherwise peaceful area. She had used phrases like multiple disturbances, unfamiliar people coming and going, and suspicious activity, all carefully crafted to stoke fear and encourage action. Just as Karen sipped her coffee, her inbox dinged. Her heart leapt as she clicked the new message. It was from the head of the neighborhood association, Tom Daniels. Subject: concern regarding new neighbors. "Hi, Karen. Thanks for bringing this to our attention. The board will review your concerns and get back to you after we've had a chance to discuss the matter. Please note that we'll also need to follow up with the Johnsons to hear their side of the story before we make any decisions. We'll be in touch. Best regards. Tom Daniels, Maple Ridge Neighborhood Association." Karen's fingers clenched around her coffee cup. "Their side of the story," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "What more do they need to know? I've given them everything." It wasn't the quick, decisive response she had been hoping for. Karen's mind began racing again, trying to think of her next move. She couldn't let them sit idly by while the Johnsons continued to undermine everything she had built in this neighborhood. But she also knew she had to tread carefully. The last thing she needed was to look like she was targeting them for the wrong reasons. She stood up from her desk and paced her living room, her thoughts swirling. "What else can I do?" she asked herself aloud. "There's got to be something more." Her gaze landed on the window, where she could see the Johnsons' house across the street. From this vantage point, everything looked perfectly normal: their children playing in the yard, Jessica tending to her garden, Anthony loading some boxes into the trunk of his car. But Karen knew better. She knew they weren't what they appeared to be. As she watched them, an idea began to form in her mind. If the neighborhood association won't act quickly enough, maybe I can push things along. Karen's plan, once hazy, started to sharpen. She remembered something from her research into neighborhood regulations, something about property values and compliance with community standards. Maybe she couldn't get the police to arrest them or the association to evict them, but she could make their lives difficult in other ways. property violations, noise complaints, anything to create enough pressure to make them feel unwelcome. "Let's see how perfect they are when the pressure's on," Karen whispered with a dark smile. Across the street, Anthony and Jessica were oblivious to Karen's plotting. Their focus had shifted to the aftermath of the police visit the night before. Anthony sat at the kitchen table, going over paperwork from his office while Jessica prepared breakfast. "That woman isn't going to stop, you know," Jessica said as she cracked an egg into a skillet, the sizzle filling the kitchen. Anthony didn't look up from his papers, but his jaw tightened. "I know," he replied. "She's not the type to back down." "She called the police on us for having a backyard barbecue," Jessica continued, her frustration bubbling up. "We're following every single rule, and she's still looking for reasons to make our lives miserable. I don't know how much longer I can keep my cool with her." Anthony sighed, setting his papers aside and rubbing his temples. "Believe me, I feel the same way. But we can't let her win. That's exactly what she wants, for us to lose our tempers and give her something real to complain about." Jessica turned off the stove and placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. "I just don't get it. We've done nothing but try to be good neighbors, and she's treating us like criminals." "It's not about us," Anthony said, picking up his fork but not yet eating. "It's about her. People like Karen don't need a real reason to go after someone. She feels threatened because we don't fit into the picture of what she thinks this neighborhood should be." Jessica sat down across from him, her frustration giving way to sadness. "I just hate that our kids have to see this. They're going to start asking questions, and I don't know what to tell them." Anthony reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "But we're not going to let her chase us out. We've worked too hard to get here, and we belong here just as much as anyone else." Jessica nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her. "What do we do next?" she asked. Anthony was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I think it's time we take some legal action," he said finally. "If she keeps harassing us, we can file for a cease and desist order. We'll draft the paperwork today and make it clear that we won't tolerate any more of this nonsense." Jessica looked relieved at the suggestion. "Good. She needs to know we're not going to roll over and take it." Later that afternoon, Anthony sat down in his home office, surrounded by legal texts and his laptop. As a lawyer, he knew how to handle this kind of situation. He'd seen it countless times in his career. Harassment, defamation, harassment, it was all too familiar. He began drafting a formal cease and desist letter, outlining Karen's behavior and making it clear that any further harassment would result in legal consequences. The letter was precise, professional, and left no room for interpretation. Anthony knew that Karen had no legal standing to continue her behavior, and he was confident that this formal action would force her to back down. As he finished the draft, he called out to Jessica. "Hey, can you take a look at this before I send it off?" Jessica came into the room, glancing over his shoulder at the letter. "Looks perfect," she said, nodding in approval. "Send it." Anthony smiled, feeling a sense of control returning to the situation. He hit print, the sound of the printer filling the room as the letter came to life on paper. The next morning, Karen received the letter. The envelope, crisp and formal, with the Johnsons' names typed neatly in the corner, arrived with the morning mail. Karen stood at her front door, staring down at it as if it were a bomb waiting to go off. Her heart raced as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words with growing fury. A cease and desist? They were threatening her with legal action? "How dare they," she whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the letter tighter. "How dare they turn this around on me?" In Karen's mind, she was the victim. She was the one protecting her neighborhood, upholding the values that had made Maple Ridge such a desirable place to live. And now, these outsiders were accusing her of harassment? She stormed inside, slamming the door behind her and pacing her living room like a caged animal. "They think they can scare me with this," she muttered, holding the letter up as if it were an enemy. "Well, they've got another thing coming." Karen knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't let this legal threat hang over her head. If the neighborhood association wasn't going to help her, and if the police weren't on her side, she would have to take matters into her own hands. That afternoon, Karen began her new campaign. She called the local zoning office, filing complaints about potential property violations at the Johnsons' house. She claimed that their fence was too high, that their garage was being used for purposes that violated community rules, and that their landscaping didn't meet neighborhood standards. Of course, none of it was true. But Karen knew that the mere inconvenience of dealing with inspections and fines would put pressure on the Johnsons, and if they refused to comply, well, then she'd have something real to use against them. Karen's goal was simple: make life so difficult for the Johnsons that they would either leave on their own or give her a reason to escalate things further. Across the street, Anthony and Jessica had no idea what was coming. They thought the cease and desist letter would be the end of it, but they were wrong. It started with a knock at the door late one afternoon. Jessica opened it to find a man in a city uniform standing on the porch, clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the man said, his tone polite but businesslike. "I'm here to conduct an inspection of your property. We've received some complaints about potential violations of zoning regulations." Jessica's stomach dropped. "What kind of violations?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. The man glanced at his clipboard. "We've had reports that your fence exceeds the allowable height, and that your garage may be used for purposes outside of residential zoning codes. We'll just need to take a quick look to verify everything's in order." Jessica stared at him for a moment, her mind reeling. This had Karen's fingerprints all over it. "There's nothing wrong with our fence or our garage," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice calm. "But go ahead and take a look. You won't find anything." The inspection took all of 20 minutes, and as expected, the inspector found nothing out of the ordinary. But the disruption was enough to throw Jessica off balance. As the inspector left, she stood on the porch, her hands clenched into fists. "This has gone too far," she muttered to herself. The inspections didn't stop there. Over the next week, city workers visited the Johnsons' house 3 more times, each time investigating new complaints, none of which turned out to be valid. Anthony and Jessica were growing more and more frustrated, their sense of peace shattered by Karen's relentless campaign. One evening, after yet another city official had come and gone, Anthony sat down at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. "I can't believe this," he said quietly. "She's using every trick in the book to make our lives miserable." Jessica sat down beside him, her face tight with anger. "We need to take this further," she said. "This isn't just harassment anymore. She's targeting us. We need to make her stop." Anthony nodded, his resolve hardening. "We will," he said. "We'll take this to court if we have to. She can't keep getting away with this." Karen was seething. The cease and desist letter from the Johnsons had been a slap in the face, a reminder that her attempts to control the neighborhood were no longer going unnoticed. In her mind, it was one thing to raise concerns, but to be threatened legally? That was crossing a line. The word harassment in the letter stuck in her brain like a thorn, agitating her every thought. "I'm not the one harassing them," she muttered to herself as she paced her living room. "I'm protecting this neighborhood." The neighborhood association hadn't responded as quickly as she hoped. She had assumed that her long-standing role in the community would grant her more leverage, but her complaints about the Johnsons were met with silence. It wasn't enough for her. Her frustration mounted, and she needed to take matters into her own hands. Karen picked up the phone and dialed the local lawyer she had used for minor property disputes in the past. If the Johnsons wanted to go the legal route, she would be ready. "This is Karen Williams," she said when the receptionist answered. "I need to speak with Mr. Jacobs about a legal matter. It's urgent." After a short wait, Mr. Jacobs picked up the phone. "Mrs. Williams, what can I do for you?" Karen explained the situation, detailing her complaints about the Johnsons, the cease and desist letter, and her frustration with how things were unfolding. "I want to file a countersuit or do something to get them off my back. They're harassing me, trying to intimidate me with this legal nonsense." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Williams, we could look into filing a suit for defamation or harassment, Mr. Jacobs said slowly, "but I'd need more evidence of actual harm or repeated actions that would constitute harassment on their part. From what you've told me, it sounds like they're responding to your complaints." Karen's grip tightened on the phone. "They're trying to paint me as a racist, Mr. Jacobs. They're trying to make it look like I'm the one causing trouble when all I'm doing is protecting my neighborhood." "I understand your concerns," Mr. Jacobs replied, "but the courts are going to need something more concrete. If you can gather any evidence that shows they're violating neighborhood ordinances or disrupting the peace, that might help your case." Karen's mind raced. I've already filed complaints about their fence, their garage, and the noise from their gatherings, but nothing's come of it yet. Isn't there something else we can do?" There was another pause. "Let me look into it, Mrs. Williams. I'll get back to you with some options, but in the meantime, I'd advise you to avoid any direct confrontation with them. We don't want this to escalate further." Karen hung up the phone, unsatisfied. Avoid confrontation? That wasn't going to work for her. The Johnsons had crossed a line by sending that letter, and she wasn't going to sit by and let them get away with it. Across the street, Anthony and Jessica were preparing for the next phase of the conflict. The cease and desist letter had been a strategic move, one they hoped would force Karen to back down, but they both knew it was unlikely she would stop. Anthony had spent the better part of the week gathering evidence of Karen's harassment, documenting the baseless complaints, the zoning inspections, and the neighborhood association emails. He was ready for the next step. That evening, Anthony sat down at the dining room table with Jessica, spreading out the paperwork they had prepared. "We're going to file a formal harassment lawsuit," he said, his voice steady but determined. "This isn't just about us anymore. She's trying to make our lives hell, and we can't let her do this to anyone else." Jessica nodded, though the weight of the situation was beginning to take its toll on her. "Do you think this will stop her?" she asked quietly, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion of weeks spent fighting back. Anthony sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if we don't take a stand now, she'll keep coming after us and after anyone else who doesn't fit her idea of what this neighborhood should be." They worked late into the night, finalizing the details of their case. Anthony, with his experience in law, had crafted a rock-solid argument. They had all the evidence they needed to prove that Karen's actions were malicious, discriminatory, and intended to drive them out of the community. As they prepared to file the lawsuit the next day, there was a sense of grim resolve between them. This wasn't the life they had envisioned when they moved into Maple Ridge. They had hoped for a quiet suburban existence where they could raise their children in peace. Instead, they were embroiled in a battle with a woman determined to uphold her own twisted version of what the neighborhood should be. The next morning, Karen received a knock on her door. She opened it to find a man in a suit standing on her porch, holding a thick envelope. "Mrs. Williams?" he asked. Karen's stomach dropped. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice shaky. The man handed her the envelope. "You've been served." Karen stared at the envelope as the man turned and walked away. Her hands shook as she tore it open and began reading the lawsuit filed against her by the Johnsons. Harassment, defamation, malicious intent. Her eyes scanned the document, her heart pounding in her chest. They were suing her for simply trying to protect the neighborhood. The audacity. She couldn't believe what she was reading. "This is outrageous," Karen shouted to the empty room, throwing the papers down on the coffee table. "They're trying to ruin me." Her anger quickly turned to panic. She had assumed she would be the one to come out on top, that the Johnsons would buckle under the pressure. But now they were turning the tables on her, and the reality of a legal battle began to sink in. She could lose. She could be the one forced to leave the neighborhood. The thought terrified her. Karen paced the room, her mind racing. "What do I do? What do I do?" she muttered, her anxiety spiraling out of control. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mr. Jacobs again. "I just got served with a lawsuit from the Johnsons," she said as soon as he picked up. "They're accusing me of harassment and defamation." Mr. Jacobs was silent for a moment. "Okay, Mrs. Williams, calm down," he said finally. "We'll respond to the suit, but we're going to need to be careful here. If they have enough evidence to back up their claims, this could get serious." Karen's panic turned to desperation. "Serious? How serious are we talking?" "Well, it depends on what they can prove," Mr. Jacobs explained. "If they can show a pattern of harassment or any intent to harm their reputation, you could be facing significant fines or worse if the court decides in their favor." Karen's mind went blank. Fines? She couldn't afford that. And worse? What could be worse than losing everything she had worked for? "We'll need to gather our own evidence to refute their claims," Mr. Jacobs continued. "But my advice is to settle this out of court if we can. A drawn-out legal battle isn't going to do you any favors." Karen's heart sank. Settle? That would mean admitting defeat, admitting that she had been wrong. But as the weight of the situation settled on her, she realized she might not have a choice. Meanwhile, the Johnsons were preparing for their court case. Anthony had spent the week coordinating with their legal team, gathering witness statements from neighbors who had overheard Karen's remarks or witnessed her harassment firsthand. They were building a case that left no room for doubt. Karen had targeted them from the moment they moved in, and her actions were driven by prejudice. Jessica had spoken to a few sympathetic neighbors, explaining the situation and asking for their support. Most were more than willing to back them up, tired of Karen's domineering presence in the neighborhood. But some were hesitant, afraid of getting involved in what was quickly becoming a bitter dispute. Still, the Johnsons felt confident in their case. They had the law on their side, and they were determined to see this through to the end. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about standing up to people like Karen who believed they could weaponize the system to push out anyone who didn't fit their narrow worldview. As the court date approached, tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Some neighbors began to distance themselves from Karen, worried that they might be dragged into the conflict. Others whispered about the lawsuit in hushed tones, wondering how things had gotten so out of hand. For Karen, the isolation was unbearable. She had always prided herself on being a respected member of the community, someone people turned to for advice or leadership. But now she was becoming a pariah, avoided, whispered about, and left to deal with the fallout of her own actions. On the day of the court hearing, Karen sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt small, out of place, like the very walls were closing in on her. Across the room, Anthony and Jessica sat with their legal team, calm and composed. They had the confidence of people who knew they were in the right. The proceedings were swift. The Johnsons' legal team presented their case methodically, laying out the pattern of harassment and discrimination Karen had directed at them. They provided evidence of the zoning complaints, the baseless police reports, and the verbal confrontations that had escalated over time. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she was simply concerned about the neighborhood, that her actions were motivated by a desire to maintain peace and order. But the evidence was overwhelming. It was clear to everyone in the room that Karen's actions had crossed the line from concern to targeted harassment. When the judge ruled in favor of the Johnsons, ordering Karen to pay damages and issue a public apology, she felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She had lost. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. Word spread quickly about the court ruling, and Karen's reputation was shattered. She had gone from being a respected, albeit overbearing, figure in Maple Ridge to someone people avoided altogether. The neighborhood she had fought so hard to control had turned its back on her. For the Johnsons, the victory was bittersweet. They had won the legal battle, but the emotional toll of the ordeal lingered. They were relieved that Karen's harassment had come to an end, but the damage to their sense of peace in the community was undeniable. As they sat on their front porch that evening, watching their children play in the yard, Anthony turned to Jessica and smiled. "We did the right thing," he said softly. Jessica nodded, though her eyes were still clouded with the weight of everything they had endured. "Yes," she replied. "We did." The courtroom decision had been swift and clear, and the weight of the ruling hung over Maple Ridge like a storm cloud. Karen's defeat was not just legal, it was personal. She had been humiliated in front of the very community she once prided herself on controlling. As she sat on her porch in the aftermath of the court ruling, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Karen had always been seen as the unofficial watchdog of the neighborhood, someone who kept things orderly and predictable. But now the people she had counted on to support her were nowhere to be found. Her phone had stopped ringing, the friendly waves from neighbors had ceased, and the gossip that once filled her afternoons was no longer whispered in her direction. The silence was deafening. Karen leaned back in her porch chair, staring blankly at the street she had watched for years. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and driveways. It was a peaceful scene, but to Karen it felt foreign, hostile even. She had lost control, and the neighborhood no longer felt like hers. Across the street, the Johnsons were enjoying a quiet evening. Their children played in the yard, laughing as they chased each other around the garden. Anthony sat on the porch steps, his laptop balanced on his knees, while Jessica sat beside him, sipping a glass of wine. To anyone passing by, they looked like a picture-perfect family. But underneath the calm exterior, both Anthony and Jessica were still grappling with the emotional toll of their legal battle with Karen. They had won, yes, but the price had been higher than they anticipated. The tension and stress of the last few months had strained their patience, and the constant scrutiny from their neighbors had taken its toll. Anthony closed his laptop, rubbing his eyes. "I can't believe it's finally over," he said, his voice low. Jessica nodded, her eyes scanning the street. "It doesn't feel like it," though she replied softly. "Even with the lawsuit behind us, I still feel like we're being watched. Like we don't really belong here." Anthony turned to her, his expression sympathetic. "We do belong here, Jess. We've earned our place, just like anyone else. Karen's gone too far, and now she's facing the consequences. It's her problem, not ours." Jessica sighed, setting her glass down on the porch railing. "I know, but it's hard to shake the feeling. This whole thing has left a bad taste in my mouth. I just want to move on, but I'm not sure if I can." Anthony wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We will move on," he said firmly. "This neighborhood is our home now, and we're not going anywhere. Karen may have tried to push us out, but she's the one who's being left behind." Karen sat on her porch for hours, watching as the lights in her neighbors' houses flickered on one by one. In the past, she might have visited Linda, her closest friend in the neighborhood, for a chat over tea or a glass of wine. But things had changed. Linda had distanced herself after the lawsuit, not openly condemning Karen, but making it clear through her absence that she didn't want to be involved in the fallout. Karen's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, her heart sinking when she saw the message from Tom Daniels, the head of the neighborhood association. Subject: community meeting follow-up. Karen. "The board has reviewed the recent court ruling, and we feel it's necessary to address the situation with the rest of the community. As a result, we've scheduled a special meeting next week to discuss the lawsuit and its implications for Maple Ridge. We want to maintain a peaceful and welcoming environment for all residents, and we believe an open discussion is the best way to move forward. We hope you can attend. Regards, Tom Daniels, Maple Ridge Neighborhood Association." Karen's stomach twisted as she read the message. "A special meeting," she whispered to herself, dread creeping into her voice. This was worse than she imagined. Not only had she lost in court, but now the entire neighborhood was going to discuss it publicly. She could already picture the whispers, the judgmental looks. The same people who had once praised her for her involvement in the community were now going to dissect her actions in front of everyone. The following week, the neighborhood meeting took place in the community center. The small hall was packed with residents, all eager to hear how the association would handle the fallout from the Johnsons' lawsuit. Karen sat toward the back of the room, trying to blend in, though she could feel eyes on her from every direction. At the front of the room, Tom Daniels cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and authoritative. "As you're all aware, there's been a recent legal dispute between two of our neighbors, and the court has ruled in favor of the Johnson family." There were murmurs throughout the room, and Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the silent judgment of the people she had once considered allies. "This neighborhood has always prided itself on being a place of respect and community," Tom continued. "But we need to acknowledge that things have changed, and it's time we start moving in a more positive direction. The board has decided that we need to address issues like harassment and discrimination head-on. Maple Ridge is a place for everyone, and we will not tolerate actions that make any of our residents feel unwelcome." The room grew quieter, and Karen's heart sank. She knew what was coming. "With that in mind," Tom said, "we are implementing new community guidelines to ensure that everyone feels safe and respected. These guidelines will include stricter rules on how residents file complaints, especially when those complaints involve personal grievances or discriminatory behavior." There was a soft murmur of approval from the crowd, and Karen felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. This was directed at her, she knew it. They were making rules to prevent people like her from speaking up, from protecting the neighborhood. Tom continued, "We want to create an environment where everyone is treated fairly, and that means holding ourselves accountable when we fail to do so. We encourage everyone to speak up if they see behavior that doesn't align with our values." Karen clenched her fists in her lap, her face burning with shame and anger. This was it, the final nail in the coffin. The neighborhood she had fought to protect was turning against her. After the meeting, Karen tried to leave quickly, hoping to avoid any confrontations, but as she made her way to the door, she caught snippets of conversations around her. "I can't believe she thought she could get away with it," one woman whispered to her friend. "It's about time someone put her in her place," another man muttered. Karen's vision blurred as she hurried outside, the voices following her like a chorus of condemnation. She had never felt so isolated, so utterly defeated. The neighborhood she had once ruled was now a place where she was no longer welcome. Back at home, Karen sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. She had never imagined that things would end this way. In her mind, she had been the one protecting Maple Ridge, ensuring that it stayed a safe, desirable place to live. But now it was clear that her version of safety had been rooted in fear and prejudice, and the community had seen through her. She thought about her past interactions with the Johnsons, the way she had watched them from behind her blinds, convinced they were a threat simply because they were different. In the quiet of her empty house, the realization crept in like a shadow she had been wrong. Karen had spent so much time trying to uphold the status quo that she hadn't stopped to consider the harm she was causing. The Johnsons weren't the enemy, they were just a family, trying to live their lives in peace. And she had become the very thing she claimed to despise, a bully. Meanwhile, the Johnsons were slowly rebuilding their sense of normalcy. After the court case and the neighborhood meeting, there was a noticeable shift in the way people treated them. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now waved as they passed by, offering friendly hellos and small gestures of support. One evening, Linda, Karen's old friend, came by with a plate of cookies. Jessica answered the door, surprised to see her. "Hi, I just wanted to stop by and say I'm sorry for everything that's happened," Linda said, her voice soft and sincere. "I didn't realize how bad things had gotten with Karen, and I should have spoken up sooner. I hope you and your family are doing okay." Jessica smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Linda. We're doing better now. It's been a rough few months, but we're getting through it." Linda handed her the cookies. "Well, if you ever need anything, just let me know. We're glad you're part of the neighborhood." As Linda walked away, Jessica closed the door and turned to Anthony, who had been listening from the living room. "Looks like things are finally starting to change around here," she said with a small smile. Anthony nodded, standing up and joining her by the door. "It's about time," he said. The Johnsons had fought hard to defend their place in the neighborhood, and now they were beginning to see the fruits of their labor. The weight of Karen's harassment had been lifted, and though the scars from the battle would remain, there was a sense of hope in the air. For Karen, the days stretched on in a blur of isolation and regret. The court's decision had left her with a hefty fine to pay, and her reputation in the neighborhood had been irreparably damaged. She no longer felt the sense of belonging she once cherished, and the social circles she had been part of for years now excluded her. Sitting alone on her porch one afternoon, Karen watched as the Johnsons' children played in the yard, their laughter carrying across the street. It was a simple, joyful sound, one that Karen had once seen as a threat to her carefully controlled world. Now she realized that it was just the sound of a family living their lives. For the first time in months, Karen felt a pang of remorse. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make amends. The day of Karen's public apology had finally arrived, and Maple Ridge was buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread quickly about the outcome of the lawsuit, and now the community was eager to witness the final chapter of what had been one of the most talked about events in recent neighborhood history. The neighborhood association had arranged for the meeting to take place in the community center, the same hall where Karen had once been regarded as a leading voice in the neighborhood. But today she would stand before her peers not as a leader, but as a woman forced to face the consequences of her actions. Karen sat at her kitchen table that morning, staring at the letter she had written, the apology she would have to deliver. Her hands shook slightly as she reread the words, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. The letter was carefully worded, crafted by her lawyer to ensure that it addressed the court's ruling without admitting too much guilt. But as Karen read the words again, she felt a deep sense of shame. "I never thought it would come to this," she whispered to herself. Her home, once her fortress, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in around her as the reality of her actions sank deeper. Her neighbors had turned their backs on her, her reputation was shattered, and now she was about to stand before them and admit that she had been wrong. The thought made her stomach churn. She looked out the window across the street at the Johnsons' house. They were outside, as usual, enjoying a sunny afternoon with their children. The kids were laughing, chasing each other around the yard, while Jessica tended to the garden and Anthony cleaned off the grill from the previous night's dinner. They seemed so at peace, so content. Karen couldn't understand it. After everything she had put them through, they had come out the other side stronger, while she had been left alone, defeated. "Maybe I was wrong," Karen whispered again, this time more to herself. The words felt foreign on her tongue, but there was a growing realization inside her that could no longer be ignored. She had lost sight of what really mattered. In her quest to preserve the neighborhood as she saw it, she had alienated herself from the very people she once called her community. And now she was about to face them head-on. The community center was packed by the time Karen arrived. Rows of folding chairs had been set up in the large hall, and nearly every seat was filled. Karen's heart raced as she walked through the door, clutching her apology letter in her hand. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the whispers behind cupped hands, the judgment in the eyes of people she had once considered friends. At the front of the room, Tom Daniels, the head of the neighborhood association, stood behind a small podium. He gave Karen a brief nod as she entered, his face unreadable. Karen made her way to the front of the room, her legs trembling with each step. She could see Linda sitting in the crowd, her face neutral but offering no comfort. Karen had been close to Linda for years, but that friendship had disintegrated in the wake of the lawsuit. Linda had distanced herself, and now she sat with the rest of the neighbors, just another observer waiting for Karen's fall from grace. Finally, Karen reached the podium. She took a deep breath and unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Karen could feel her throat tightening, her palms sweating. She glanced down at the letter, the carefully crafted words blurring before her eyes. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice shaky but audible. "I've been asked to speak today to address the recent events that have taken place in our community. As many of you know, I was involved in a legal dispute with my neighbors, the Johnson family, which has now been resolved in court." The room remained silent, the crowd hanging on her every word. "The court found that my actions constituted harassment," Karen continued, her voice growing weaker with each word. "And I accept the court's ruling. I want to apologize to the Johnson family for any distress or harm my actions may have caused them. That was never my intention." Her words felt hollow, rehearsed, as if they were coming from someone else. The crowd remained impassive, waiting for more. Karen's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to say more, something real, something that would show the community that she understood the gravity of what she had done. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look up from the paper and meet the eyes of the people in front of her. I made a mistake," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I let my fear and my need for control cloud my judgment. I convinced myself that I was protecting this neighborhood, but in reality I was pushing people away. I was wrong. The Johnsons have every right to be here, just like anyone else. And I'm sorry for everything I've done to make them feel otherwise." There was a brief silence in the room, and then slowly the crowd began to murmur. Karen stood at the podium, feeling the weight of her words settle in the air. She had said what needed to be said, but whether it would be enough to repair the damage she had done remained to be seen. Karen took a step back from the podium, her face pale, her hands trembling. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet their gazes. She turned quickly and walked toward the exit, her steps quick and uneven. The community center door swung open, and Karen stepped out into the afternoon sun, the weight of her apology still heavy on her shoulders. Inside the community center, Anthony and Jessica sat quietly, watching as Karen made her exit. The apology had been difficult to listen to, not because of its content, but because of the emotions it stirred within them. It was clear that Karen had been forced into the apology, that her words, while necessary, were driven more by obligation than genuine remorse. Jessica turned to Anthony, her expression pensive. "What do you think?" she asked softly. Anthony sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's a start," he said. "But I'm not sure if she really understands what she did. Jessica nodded, her thoughts mirroring Anthony's. At least it's over, she said, though the relief she had hoped to feel was tempered by the reality of the situation. They had won the legal battle, but the scars from the ordeal still lingered. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors came up to the Johnsons, offering words of support and solidarity. Linda approached, her face warm with apology. "I'm so sorry for what you've gone through," Linda said, her voice sincere. "If I had known how bad it was getting with Karen, I would have spoken up sooner. I should have been a better friend to you." Jessica smiled softly, though there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Thank you, Linda," she said. "We appreciate the support. We just want to move on from this." Anthony nodded in agreement. "We've all learned something from this," I think he added. "It's time to start building a better community for everyone." As the weeks passed, life in Maple Ridge slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The legal battle with Karen became a part of neighborhood lore, something people whispered about at block parties and mentioned in passing at community meetings. But for the Johnsons, it was a chapter they were eager to close. Anthony and Jessica focused on rebuilding the sense of peace they had hoped to find when they first moved into the neighborhood. Their children were adjusting well, making friends at school and enjoying the new opportunities that Maple Ridge offered. The tension that had once filled the air had begun to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism that things were changing for the better. One afternoon, Anthony stood in the front yard, watching as his children played in the driveway. He smiled as they laughed and chased each other, their joy infectious. Jessica joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It feels good to finally have some peace," she said, her voice soft. Anthony nodded, his gaze focused on their children. "It does," he agreed. "We've been through a lot, but we've come out stronger." Jessica leaned her head on his shoulder, a sense of contentment settling over her. "Do you think Karen will ever really change?" she asked after a moment. Anthony was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "I don't know," he admitted. "People like Karen, they hold on to their fear for a long time. But maybe this whole thing has given her something to think about. Maybe, in time, she'll learn from it." Jessica nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "I hope so," she said softly. Across the street, Karen sat on her porch, watching the Johnsons from afar. Her once immaculate garden had fallen into disrepair, the flowers wilting under the summer heat. She felt a deep sense of regret, not just for the actions that had led to her downfall, but for the life she had built on fear and control. For the first time in years, Karen felt small, powerless. She had been so certain that she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting her neighborhood from a threat. But now, as she watched the Johnsons' children play, laughing and carefree, she realized that she had been the one threatening the peace. Karen sighed, leaning back in her porch chair. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe she could find a way to make amends, not just with the Johnsons, but with herself. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The laughter of the Johnsons' children echoed through the air, a reminder that life went on, even after the hardest battles were fought. Karen closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, and for the first time in a long while she felt something she hadn't expected: hope.